Welcome to That Good Fight, a Reformation for Gentlemen. My name is Aaron Edwards, and I'm joined by another very special guest this evening, though I think it's the afternoon for him, which is CR Wiley. Hello, or Chris.
Chris is fine, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
No worries. It's a pleasure to have you. I guess you don't insist on people calling you CR, like JR or something. Kind of work like
no,
that.
Yeah. Actually, the story behind using the letters is pretty pedestrian. I don't know if you've ever Googled your name and discovered like half the people in the world have the same name as you. I discovered that, and some of the people who have my name, I'm not really all that crazy about. So I figured, well, I got to find out a way to make it easy for people to find me online, and so that's why I use the letters. I feel a little pretentious sometimes, but Anyway, so that's.
You're not too far off C.S. Lewis's, generation compared to me, at least. I had a similar thing actually. There's a guy who's actually. So I'm an academic, albeit a disemployed academic, infamously so in this country. But there's another academic in Britain, in Northern Ireland, called Aaron Edwards, who also writes on religious stuff, but he's more like a secular religious conflict military historian. So as I'm emphasizing militant Christianity, sometimes our stuff gets crossed over. And I once got an angry email from someone, complaining about all these things that they didn't like about something he'd written, and I was really tempted to kind of, angrily respond back in the author. So I had to insert halfway through my publications, I think I had journal articles with Aaron Edwards, and I had to start putting Aaron P. Edwards. So that was my pretentious thing. I didn't quite go for the AP Edwards. I should probably have done that. He might have thanked me for it, given everything that I end up saying and getting in trouble for. So that's nice. Good to know the story behind the CR of the CR Wiley. So it'd be interesting because I think there'll be some British listeners. We've got lots of American and British listeners, and even, as you will hear later on, listeners in India as well, and far further afield. But over this side of the pond, there'll be fewer people who obviously know who you are. In certain Reformed American circles, you're kind of now a household name, and author of many books, and we'll talk about some of your books and some of your kind of thinking and writing as we go through in our conversation. But I'll say that the first impression I had of you, I think I first came across you when you spoke at the Grace Agenda conference in Moscow for Doug Wilson's kind of conference, which would have been, I presume, was that 2017 or 2019?
Sounds right. I can't remember.
Like that. 18, around that kind of time. It was pre-COVID. It was before the apocalypse. Right. So it was.
Right. That's right. I remember. That's true.
Anyone who got red pilled before COVID, gets a special badge of honor. So I remember coming across you and thinking, like, who is this guy? You were a completely different kind of character to anyone I'd seen on the evangelical speaking circuit. It was kind of like, Doug Wilson himself was a slightly different character, but he'd had time on the kind of big boy platform when John Piper had got him to Desire of God. But it was like, you were a very different kettle of fish altogether. It was sort of like, I couldn't believe that you were a pastor. Honestly, this was the impression.
Sometimes my own people don't believe I'm a pastor.
Are you still pastoring us over those years? Yeah. So it's kind of like, and there's something about that. I was like, I think it must be there's something to do with the evangelical. It's something to do with the way that evangelical men are formed in seminaries or something. I thought, this guy is different. He's formed differently. He clearly loves the Lord. He's faithful, but he doesn't sound like a pastor. He doesn't sound particularly emotive. He maybe comes across, this would be a little bit proud almost, because he just seems so cool and collected and together, and we're not used to seeing that at all. So could you talk us through, like, how does that, are you familiar with that impression? Do other people who haven't come across you see that? And what's kind of behind your way of being, I guess, that makes you slightly different to other pastors on that normal circuit?
Yeah, well, okay. In terms of your observation, I have had that before. And I think it might have something to do with the fact that I don't try to be evangelical pastory. In other words, I've actually kind of
you didn't get the memo.
I've seen it, and I'm sorry if this hurts anyone's feelings, but it's kind of distasteful to me. I just look at it and it's like I don't have any interest in that. In fact, I remember I was at a Presbyterian. There was this young guy who was being examined. You know how those work, and for, I think, licensure or something. And he got up and he said, "I've always wanted to be a pastor." And I looked at him. I said, "Are you kidding me?" are you for real? And he kind of looked like it. He kind of looked like maybe he had been like, I don't know, as a kid, when other kids were playing army or playing football or what we call football.
Yeah.
He was maybe pretending to pay a pastor, looking at himself in the mirror. I don't know. But anyway, that's not really anything that has been I've aspired to. I remember one time I was on the board of a fairly good sized developer in Seattle. This is a company that builds apartment complexes and stuff like that. And there was and owned by believers, actually all Russian guys, all Russian believers, all guys who had actually fled the former Soviet Union after the fall of communism and came to the States and are now millionaires. But anyway, I was on their board because they wanted to have, and they knew I had a background in construction as a pastor. So I was unusual. But there was another guy that they brought in from South Carolina. It was a cool guy. And we were in a meeting, and he looked over at me after we had been talking about, I don't know, balance sheets or something. And he said, "You're a pastor? I can't believe it." So yeah, I get that every once in a while, but it's not something I really think about much. Or I'm like, most regular pastors. I wish I could do a better job, just because there's always more to do, and you always feel like you're not doing enough. And I try to be faithful, but I don't have like a vibe. I guess I don't try to do the pastor vibe.
Yeah. I guess if you were trying to do the pastor vibe, that would be very evangelical pastory, maybe.
Yeah, probably.
to your observation, affectation or something, putting it on. And then there's the thing. Now, the other side to that coin might be, let's say, if I was trying to put a coin in for the standard, evangelical pastor in the evangelical tradition of the Great Awakening and the etc. So, I mean, I'm thinking of this because I preached recently on Psalm 40, and I'm encouraging the congregation to not restrain their lips. That's what David says. So you strike me as someone who has imbibed the proverb of David's son, of course, Solomon: "Whoever restrained his lips is prudent." Like you're quite, you keep a good emotional temperature. You're not going to get flustered. I think if something went down, I'd want you around because you're just not going to get flustered. But there's going to be, Chris will know what to do. I kind of sense.
Yeah.
Whereas you do get, but there's also that sense. There is a genuine biblical sense which all Christians should cultivate, isn't it? In terms of the life of the Spirit. And David saying there are times where I haven't hidden his deliverance in my heart. I've not restrained my lips. I've spoken out, and I've not been worried about what people think of me. That, I guess, there's another side of the coin where that could be would that be a temptation to someone in your disposition, do you think?
To just say what's ever in my mind, or
to not do it in a way, to hide back. Like what David's saying in that psalm is like, I've hidden it. I don't want to hide it like I've done before.
Well, I don't think so, but I mean, I do try to, I guess, time my whatever I have to say. I guess, there's always something to be angry about. There's always something to be, to post something about.
Yeah.
And I've tried to stay away from attacking maybe a particular person unless I know fully what's going on and it's public. But I guess in terms of being expressive or just kind of letting it all hang out, maybe that's another way to put it. It's kind of an Americanism, I guess. Yeah, there are times when that happens. Maybe after I've had a beer, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So, but yeah, the parallel for Acts, where they say, right. Peter's like, "We're not drunk as you suppose." Chris actually has had a couple of drinks.
He might be.
That's why he's kind of. Yeah, that's right. It's possible. I know it's only 3:00 in the afternoon, but hey, it helps him. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah. So, but it is an interesting observation because I do think it's helpful to have the other side of the coin. Though I'm bringing you the other side of that coin, I actually think that you're a very helpful voice to show an unflustered, keeping that emotional temperature. And it's very masculine. It's a good masculine trait to have. It's a good fatherly trait to have. It's something that it doesn't come naturally to many men of the generations of the last 50 odd years, because we've almost been taught to go with yourself. It's very self-focused, etc. But it's particularly intriguing that you've said, I think you might have said once or twice in other shows you've been on, you were raised I wouldn't say, am I correct in saying you were raised by hippies, or like you were raised by your parents are kind of left wing and,
Well, it was,
in that flower
yeah,
generation?
I can fill you in on it. I mean, my father was worked for the University of Buffalo and then was at Washington University of St. Louis, kind of junior faculty in both those places. And this was in the 60s, so there were just a lot of crazy things going on all around. My father was more of a libertarian. My mother was definitely on the socialist side of things. And, I grew up in kind of an environment filled with hippies. I mean, we had hippies who lived with us, roomed with us. And my folks were, kind of into kind of exploring alternative, I guess, belief systems and stuff, so they got into the Baha'is for a while. But then my father landed in Scientology when I was about 4 or 5. So I actually grew up in,
Wow.
That world. And so I remember.
Did you go along with it?
No, I always kind of weirded me out. And there's just really creepy vibe to Scientology. And even if you got a, I think most kids kind of pick up on it. At least I did. My sister did. And this is an odd thing to say, but in God's providence, my father deserted our family when I was about 11. That was a bad thing, and for many reasons, but the kind of the redeeming reason was that I didn't have his influence anymore, when it came to, just the world of Scientology. And so I left that world. I was, got out of that world, and I ended up in Western Pennsylvania, which is in the American scene, a very blue collar and socially conservative environment, which was very different than the world that I had known to that point. Because the world I had known to that point was full of artists and musicians and cultists, and that kind of stuff, and academics. Like they all go together.
Yeah.
The coffee's good, but the politics are really weird. And so, that was kind of the world of my childhood, and it still is my extended family. I've got some very interesting relatives, but anyway, I found myself in this kind of Norman Rockwell kind of world, suddenly thrust into it, and it was very refreshing to me. It was wholesome, stable. My own home life was neither of those things. My mother was in and out of mental institutions for the rest of her life, and she died young. Wow. So I was largely on my own from the time I was young, and after that, I spent time as a ward of the state and foster care and stuff until, I was out on my own.
So that's a really hard time you've had. I mean, did you have male mentors, kind of almost surrogating for your father?
Yeah. I don't know if they would have thought of themselves that way, but I definitely looked at them as role models. These were all. So I got involved in a little evangelical church, blue collar church, Western Pennsylvania. Now, to kind of give the vibe of it, it was kind of Trumpist or Trumpian before Trump. And what I mean by that is that in the American left, this is probably something you see in the UK, but I can't say since I'm not from there. But there was a socially conservative, economically liberal in the sense that it was union kind of dynamic. So these were men who were blue collar factory guys who voted. Now the Democratic Party today has completely alienated them, and that's why they're now Trump's base. They were just basically kicked out of the Democratic Party, or at least relied on to vote, but not ever represented any, since the 1990s with NAFTA and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so those people really took me in this little church, and I got to see men who were solid fathers and provided for their families. It was like, and generally speaking, pretty healthy families. And so I got to see those guys in action. And many of them were remarkably capable men who could do just about everything that you would want a father to be able to do. I mean, these guys. Have you ever seen the film The Deer Hunter? I don't know if you're familiar.
I haven't seen it. No. I know of it. Yeah,
It's actually about Western Pennsylvania. So those guys were all hunters. They were all guys who worked on their own cars. These are guys who could pull an engine, and rebuild it, and work on their house and do all this kind of stuff. They were all blue collar guys. And so kind of the love I have for working with your hands is derived from those years. Knowing those guys. The artsy stuff. I'm also kind of an artsy side too. Over the back, behind me is an angel. This is an actual. I don't know if you've ever heard of Howard Finster. He's one of America's most famous folk artists. But that's an original Howard Finster, and he's a pretty cool guy. He was a Baptist pastor, kind of funky, but his art is on display in the Smithsonian and the Met in New York City and stuff like that. But you wouldn't necessarily know about him unless you were around in the 1970s and 80s in the United States. But
it does have a 70s. So was that made in the 70s?
This piece it's 1990s, I'm pretty sure. And he's a guy that I think some of your listeners would enjoy. If you want to get a little taste of him, he was on Johnny Carson. I don't know if you're familiar with Johnny Carson, but he was a late night television kind of talk guy. Right. And Finster took over the show. He could play banjo. He could tell stories. He was a pastor. He was a he was kind of a fundamentalist Southern Baptist preacher who was also a folk artist. Wow. So he was like this famous folk artist. He did album covers for the Cars. And I think the B-52s were big fans of his, so he had all these crazy,
but he was a conservative evangelical pastor.
In fact, when they did something at the Met on him, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they were showing his works. He actually preached a hellfire and brimstone sermon and called for repentance from everybody. And they were all like, yeah, that's exactly what we'd expect. That's part of that's part of the Howard Finster vibe.
So they won't take it like metaphorical. He must be doing some really clever philosophical.
There's no way you would be able to confuse him with someone that would be so sophisticated that to actually even think in those terms.
Yeah. Wow, well, that's fascinating. So you're around these blue collar, like this kind of world. And of course, I can see why someone like yourself who doesn't fit the normal mold of a pastor, then is also appreciates the work of someone else that doesn't fit the mold of a pastor in every sense. But you were presumably then you were learning this kind of hands-on practical masculinity, fathering really. But these other guys presumably didn't have this other string to the bow that you might have had, which was this intellectual capacity for the arts as well. Presumably that's the thing, isn't it? Generally speaking, there is a simplicity, and like, we're going to get on with it. And we don't, we know our lane. Whereas there's some, I guess, those in the intelligentsia tend not to do that. So.
Well, yeah, they don't really even care about anything outside their lane. That's the problem with the intelligentsia. Yeah, but I kind of feel like amphibious, I suppose you could say. I can like exist in different worlds. If you could say like the solid world of the being on the land, that would be like the blue collar world, and then sort of the funky, sort of fishy, artsy, intellectual. I lived in Cambridge, right between Harvard and MIT for a decade, so I'm pretty comfortable with that world too.
Right. That's fascinating. So, yes, again, that kind of another way in which the pastorate model is kind of blown open. And with that, in terms of the working with your hands, I know a pastor not far from where I am, and he was a builder, had his own building company, and he sat listening to sermons from pastors for years, and just felt like they were going over everyone's head, including his. And he wasn't an unintelligent guy. He just felt like the pastor spending 25 hours preparing their sermon every week is like, it puts them into this world where they're kind of in on it. They might be brilliant with they know every commentary, etc. They go into the Greek, but actually it doesn't really hit home. It doesn't really meet them in the measurements and weights of the real world. And he's someone who deals with that day to day. And if someone makes a mistake, if someone's not doing well, this house is going to fall down. And so it's like, you can't just say, oh, sorry, I made an error. Like yes, you did. And you're going to, like, someone's going to die now, or like you might get fired or this, and so as a pastor, it seems like he would say there was this ethereality to the pastorate and to the pulpit and so eventually he was like, I think a position came open, and he ended up becoming a pastor kind of accidentally against his sort of better judgment. He would have said he's been a pastor for about 7 years. Now he's the one in the pulpit, but I guess it's helped him been working with Weights and Measures for most of his life. He preaches in that way.
Well, that's great.
ways.
I'm glad to hear about his story. I think that's right. I like, a couple things. I think that, because I was a framer for a while, and I had my own, remodeling business that I had for a while. And I've also owned investment real estate and have done that since the early 1990s. So I've always been working on my properties. And what that has done for me is it's given me a basis for a relationship with guys who are not bookish. And I think that they pick up on that pretty quick. So I've always had in my churches a lot of blue collar guys, but I've also had academics. So it's kind of fun to be able to have that kind of range in your congregation, where you're preaching to guys with PhDs and guys who just have a high school diploma and have been swinging a hammer for 30 years.
Pietism,
I think that's definitely the way to think about it. Although my argument is that Paul is actually because of his background in the trades and his ability to provide for himself, far more capable than maybe we might assume. But he definitely is an A-lister intellectually. That's for sure. Everybody knew it.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he actually, to be honest, in a way, like what we've been describing, that kind of confluence of those two spheres, you do see that in Paul. You're right. The tent making, and it is amazing. When I was speaking to a group of pastors in India earlier this year, not the one that we'll talk about later, actually, but just online, I was invited to come speak to someone who oversees various little churches, and in that context, when someone decides to become a pastor, it's like if they do something else, they feel it's a kind of shame, and they're letting God down. So therefore, they have to be so they're incredibly poor, and they have to be entirely dependent on this guy who's running, this group of say 30 odd churches, and they're trying to gather money to try and pay these guys. And I keep saying to them, like, why are they full-time pastors? They've only got like 8 or 10 people to look to, like, they're pastoring, and it doesn't make sense to me. Like here, and far be it for me as a Westerner to tell you in my far more affluent situation, but it doesn't strike me as even biblical. I don't know why they're full. It doesn't. Paul, if anyone had an excuse not to work, it would be Paul. Like, look at his life; it's ridiculous life, and yet he's providing for himself. And there's something about that actually is a good, as it were, in terms of like a difficult good in the kind of Thomist sense that it's worth pursuing.
Yeah, and he makes a point of saying, "I didn't take anything from you." In other words, I could have required this, but I did not. I think in part that was due to the fact that we had all those sophists that were going around, kind of like, Anthony, Robbins, or like, I don't know, Joel Osteen, with their hands out all the time, and just and so I think in part he was trying to make a distinction between himself and those guys. But at the same time, I think that it's really valuable to be able to wear 2 or 3 different hats and kind of move, and put them on and off pretty quickly. And it really, I think, strengthens your connection to guys, particularly men, in a congregation. Now, if you're in an entirely, say, sort of a white collar environment, more of a cerebral setting, then people might not know what to make of you. Here's a fun story. So my wife comes from a very significant evangelical family. Her uncle was the chairman of the NIV translating committee. So I remember we went to his house to see him and his wife Mabel. This is back in the 80s, and we drive up. I'm working. I'm in my first graduate program, so I'm in seminary. But I'm on the side. I'm working as a deck builder with a bunch of other seminary guys. We had this company that so we would all go to class in the morning and then go out to the work sites in the afternoon and build decks and beautiful homes in Kansas City. And I remember we arrived at the house and he kind of came out. He was an old Brahmin. Brahmin is what we would refer to in New
Wow.
England as one of the old families. But anyway, so he
Yeah.
comes out to
Yeah.
the car to escort my wife and his niece into the house with me, and the first thing he says to me is, "Ah, you drive a truck. How interesting." I got the point.
Brilliant. Yeah.
That's not very professional,
Yeah. You probably have the English aristocracy to thank for that. That's probably we've wafted that over the pond.
Well,
Probably.
well, the old Brahmin in New
downstream.
England, I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but it's a term that's used for particularly the old New England families, particularly around Boston.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, that'll be the kind of the high caste analogy,
Right.
I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Fascinating. Oh, that's fascinating. But so in many ways, again, like people again listening to this will be think, okay, so pastor, got an intellectual thing going on, writing books. You've been a college professor, haven't you? Literature or philosophy, was it?
Yeah.
And philosophy, and with an interest in literature and art, also knows how to build stuff and has companies. And this is again the kind of stuff not only that people don't think pastors think about, but also what struck me in the first book of yours that I read, which was back then when I first heard you, I think, The Household and the War for the Cosmos, which I think is a beautiful title. And I remember coming across, I was tasked to do a lecture by one of my friendly colleagues. Didn't always have friendly colleagues. One of my friendly evangelical colleagues said, I've got to do a lecture on masculinity and femininity from a biblical perspective. So I had 90 minutes to cover the entirety of the Bible on masculinity and femininity. And I was determined to get this one quote from your book in. I mean, I have to do a ridiculous survey and also having to do like half an hour of trigger warnings for all of the feminists in the room who are like, we're going to open the Bible. I know you think you are biblical. I know you think you're evangelical and that means you like the Bible, but we're going to look at some passages that you're not going to like. If you care about what the Bible says about masculinity and femininity, you're not going to like it. And you need to be prepared for that. But it was the quote that really struck me, which was so spot on from that book. I say quote, I mean, I'm paraphrasing it, but I'm used to paraphrasing it, was that you never used to look at the household codes and see them as all that big a deal, the household codes in the New Testament, until you started to realize how scrupulously people were avoiding them. And that made you think, actually, maybe they're actually fundamental to everything. And so that I presume that's the heart of the household and the war for the cosmos, this dramatic, scape for everything that you're thinking. And I think that's absolutely spot on. I remember a moment when I was sat there in TGC world, you're not allowed to think anything outside the gospel-centered lens. You're not allowed to care too much about anything in the world. You can't, it'll be an idolatry at there's demon idolatry over everything in the world. Yet we all yet we kind of idolize certain commentaries and books and certain experiences that are in the world, but we don't know how that makes sense, which can tell you to keep going. And I remember reading Ephesians 5 for the 17,000th time and going, this is crazy. This whole notion of male-female complementarity as being an optional extra. Now, none of the TGC guys saw it as an optional extra. You couldn't join TGC, and that was a controversy at some point, maybe 2010-ish. I remember John Piper being on a panel being asked this. Why can't an egalitarian join TGC? If it's all about gospel-centeredness, well, that's not the gospel. You can get saved and be an egalitarian. So why just, and then people were pushing it and you couldn't go, there's a kind of logic. And most of us were kind of like, oh, well, it's a slippery slope and you'll end up denying the gospel if you're egalitarian. That's all they could say. They couldn't say anything more, fundamental. They couldn't bring in natural law. They couldn't speak about God's wisdom. It was more just like the textbook says you're not allowed to do this and you're allowed to do that. And that's why we believe it, because it's the textbook and the gospel is the foundation of that textbook. And so that's what happens. But ultimately, you think of even the analogy of the gospel is a patriarchal image. It's even in the nice Ephesians 5, let alone the 1 Peter 3, which no one likes to talk about, where the wives are called to call their husbands Lord. But there's something in that book of yours that really was helpful. Even if it's just a little thin book, I'd highly recommend it to people. But you bring out some of these things about what a household is for. So it is about masculinity, femininity, but in many ways it's about the power of that household and the way it's been completely undersold in modernity, isn't it? So do you want to just talk a little bit about that and what was behind that, and maybe a bit about the kind of family economy that you get into?
Sure, yeah. I think about these things all the time. As you probably guess, because I grew up in an environment where none of these things were ever discussed or talked about, and everything eventually fell apart. I found myself in a situation where when it came time to establish a household of my own with my wife, I wanted a little guidance. So I started thinking about this stuff more deeply. And it never occurred to me that you could have the gospel without biblical ethics. Maybe that's not the way more people mainly put it, but it's almost as like, there's this juridical kind of understanding of the gospel that, is one thing, and then sanctification is somehow completely divorced from that, or, if that's the way, sometimes it's put. So I had an interest in the subject of the household, particularly from the standpoint of performing one's duties. So when I was working on one of my graduate programs, this is when I was at Harvard, I wanted to explore the theme of duty, and everybody kept talking about Kant. And I said, I don't want to do deontological ethics. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something older than that. And so that's what drove me into the classics, drove me to Aristotle, Xenophon, eventually found my way, into the Aeneid, and everything started to just kind of come together. And it's one of those things where, it's the old, telling a fish about water kind of thing, where in antiquity, the household was just so taken for granted that life without it being sort of the structure of reality for people was inconceivable. The modern way of looking at the world mechanistically is the revolution. As we understand ourselves as individuals, as we understand ourselves as sort of living sort of with each other, relying primarily upon sentiments and emotions to kind of hold things together, that all that would have been considered insufficient in the first century to even hold a household together. So you need there was really no alternative to the household. I mean, they didn't have the kind of corporate work environments that we live in and work in today. That again is a product of modernity. So as I kept sloughing off all of this kind of modern stuff to try to get down to what life was like in antiquity, I saw that even though some of the terminology was different, the patterns of life between, say, Israelites and Romans were very similar. And the ways they even thought about the cosmos, in terms of the larger order, very similar. The differences had to do with who was in charge and how things were run and stuff like that. But in terms of like the furniture of reality, all the pieces were there. And so when that occurred to me, I noticed some things. God the Father. Okay. God the Son, okay. God the Son, and God the Son inheriting all things. There's a term for that, primogeniture.
Kind of checks out.
Primogeniture. Yeah. And so, unless you're on good terms with the Son, you don't have any access to anything, because the Son gets it all. I mean, it all just kind of Mother Church, all this stuff. The bride of, you're just like, okay, this whole sort of personal relationship with Jesus vibe is a modern framework for thinking about salvation. The older framework, the framework that is the basis for the household and also draws on the household to understand salvation, is foundational, and it was established by God too. So it's not as though you're sort of reading into the gospel kind of ancient Roman culture or ancient, Hebraic culture, Semitic culture. What you're dealing with is a way of understanding reality that people in the past took for granted and kind of intuitively understood, and didn't need a lot of, explaining, because people just kind of got it. Today, we need to explain it because nobody gets it, or very few people get it. Now, one of the things I have noticed is that when I do deal with people who are from more traditional societies, they get it intuitively. I remember I was at a church in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is like the armpit of New York City, but it's full of immigrants from all over the world. And I was at a church pastored by a really great guy named Sam Perez. And I did a talk on my book, Man of the House. And all the guys from like Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America, they're all nodding. Like, yeah, that's how I grew up. That's how I grew up. They just kind of got it. They just knew it. And I was like, just giving them an explanation for something they kind of knew intuitively.
That's fascinating. So as you say, like there's something that's been lost in modernity. We need to kind of recover it. And you're going back, not doing. It's interesting. Some might have heard what you said there and go, "Oh, that sounds a bit like critiquing the individual relationship with Jesus." That's kind of what those emergent church guys were saying, but they were bringing in this kind of pseudo-intellectual, postmodern Hebraic stuff. I don't know if you're familiar. I mean, you guys invented it, the American immersion.
I remember those guys.
It was kind of like, thank you, America.
Yeah, we've been poisoning the world in many ways.
That's right. I mean, I guess arguably we give you our trash, you give us your trash. You know, it's a kind of symbiotic system. But there's like, they used to critique. They were heavy on communitarianism. They were heavy on like, this ancient rabbi said this, and therefore what you believe about this Bible passage is the opposite of what you thought it was, all that kind of stuff. But it was also critiquing the individual relationship with God. Now, there's a careful way that has to be done, isn't there? Because there's lots of people who became Christians, let's say at a Billy Graham rally, or in some understanding where they did genuinely, it is an individual experience, and there are biblical examples of individual experience. And yet, as you say, even the example that might come to everyone's mind, let's say the Philippian jailer, you know, what must I do to be saved? Well, that's me. But then even there's that sense of him and his whole household coming to faith. So it's like, even in those really clear examples of these individuals, you see that wider sense of a household and what that means and how it matters. Of course, there are going to be individuals who are not in households, perhaps, but it's just like it doesn't kind of compute with. It's like we get modernity. We go, can we have modernity as our baseline and make the gospel fit it, rather than can we just actually dig below this? But no one knows how to dig below that surface, so they're kind of like, I guess we have to go with what right. We've been given. Which you can still become a Christian into that world. You're still genuinely one of faith. It's still okay to actually emphasize individual salvation, but it can't be exclusively that, and it can't be on modernity's terms.
Yeah, right? One of the big problems, of course, with the emergent guys is they didn't want the household back. They didn't like that. They wanted to have communitarianism and kind of the kibbutz model kind of thing, you know, where you got this little
cafe church,
or just some kind of weird kind of commune vibe right out of the 60s, you know.
Yes.
So that's goofy. There's a contempt for creation that I think is really part of the modern outlook. You know, even the people who say they're eco, you know, activists or whatever, they're not really interested in traditional cultures, only insofar as maybe there are some interesting practices that seem to be kind of friendly and green, but they're not actually interested in like the social structures or the taboos or any of that kind of stuff. And so I'm an advocate for something that's terribly unpopular, and that's bringing back the pre-modern household and adapting it to our times. I mean, obviously, we need to live in the world that we find ourselves in. But it's been fascinating to watch Paul Kingsnorth. Are you familiar with Kingsnorth? So I'm working my way through his recent book, Against the Machine, because I'm going to be at a conference with him, and I'm actually going to be the moderator for a panel that he's on. Okay. So I needed to read his book. So I got an advanced review copy, and it's quite good. Great. There's some things I just don't go along with entirely.
He's a little bit anti-Christendom, isn't he? He's like his first things talk was a bit like, but I like a lot of the other
I'm
stuff.
with you. He actually doesn't take that tack in this book. So I think that maybe that was an early phase in his development of an idea that I think is promoting with this book, and that is. And I think what he's done is he's figured out a way to extricate modernity from Christendom. And I think that he's against modernity, but I think he's actually for kind of a medieval Christian outlook and understanding. And I think that now he's talking more about the West and not Christendom. And what he means by the West isn't like our medieval heritage. He's thinking about, something from the Enlightenment on, or maybe from the Renaissance on. And even his critique of the Reformation, which, is something that you run into sometimes in like Catholic circles and so forth. It's not so much based on some a particular reading, a nominalist reading of Luther or something like that. It's more like the world, even though there was a lot of corruption, at least was working from the same script, and that script was thrown out, and everything kind of went crazy. And it's within that craziness that the modern project kind of came into being. So his point isn't so much that the Reformation is bad, as much as it was a socially disruptive event, which there's no getting around that. and it's within the chaos of what that follows that the modernist project emerges. So, but getting back to my point.
Which is basically the Enlightenment, right. Secular Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
That comes from
getting back, so he's got a chapter in there on the household, and it's really quite good, and he's advocating for it. So I'm not alone.
Okay, so because he had you're not alone, because he had an interest. I think he had a kind of eco hippie kind of liberal background, didn't he? And then he kind of converted to Christianity, became Eastern Orthodox, and then it's kind of he's been writing a lot about hermits and kind of saints who are kind of away from, against the machine. So we'll actually come back onto that later on, because we'll get on when we talk a little bit AI type stuff. He'll be an interesting voice to feed into, I'm sure, on that. But just this on the notion of the household, I think it's fascinating that the stuff you talk about, the household economy. I had someone from one of my Indian listeners came and asked me to pass on a question to you. I'll paraphrase his one. I've got another one to ask you later on. But he wanted to know, how do you, because you've got this big vision of like how a father might, let's say, do the things that your father didn't do for you, and many fathers in our generation haven't done, which is pass on those practical skills and help them on their way to kind of help sons and daughters and to contribute to a household economy, so that you're not just an individual. Here's your device, here's your pocket money or your allowance, whatever you guys call it over there, and you go and go and live your life, and I'll discipline you when it pertains to some things, but generally then you're kind of on your own, off you go. I had to make it on my own. But actually the vision that you're kind of recovering is quite a normal one in historically, which is, no, you're going to follow your father's trade, or he's going to help set you up in some ways, he can support you. And money matters in a way that is uncomfortable for evangelicals. That's something else that comes out in that book, which was, I was like, well, we're not used to talking about money in positive terms. It's like we only think of it like you're not allowed to think, like, because the love of money is all kind of evil. So it's like, therefore, just get rid of it as soon as you can. Give it to the church. Get it off your hands. And you're kind of like, no, the household is supposed to be a supportive economy, and of course to bless others. It's not like to hoard it, like Smaug. Like, it is actually to be beneficent to others. And I think that that's something that comes out. But there are many men who now live urban lifestyles. They actually have their corporate job. Maybe they'd like to have some dream to do, but they need to support their family. They're a doctor. They're working in a city. They'd love to have their Joel Salatin homestead somewhere, but they can't. And what advice would you give to them? How would they go about creating the household economy? How could they read your book or your other book, Man of the House, where you talk about this? How could they apply that practically in their life? Would you just say, look, you just need to change your life, you need to quit your job or go part-time, or would you say, are there any little things you could give them advice to start a journey where they are in their particular situation, where their life is outside the home?
Well, I think a couple of things, 2 or 3 things maybe. One is when you work for someone else, you can think of it as just something that you go and do to get money to go home and feed yourself and pay your mortgage, or you can think about it as sort of paid, a kind of a paid apprenticeship. And if you approach it with that frame of mind, you go into an employment environment with the notion that this is not just simply me exchanging my time and my energy for income. It's more of a learning experience that will help me to develop my skills that I might not be able to see how the things I'm learning will transfer, but as I master these various things, the range of my agency will increase. And with that range of agency will come opportunities, and you'll develop, kind of an ability to see opportunity, because you're now thinking about the skills that you possess and how they can be applied in different ways. So I think that's a good way to do it. Think about your employment. Obviously, there are some forms of intellectual property that are proprietary and you can't take. I mean, they belong to your employer. But there are many things that you are able to learn in the process of being in an environment where you are exchanging your labor for income, that you'll be able to take with you the rest of your life. And with that, and then another thing to think about is, again, when you think about your household as a productive enterprise, rather than just simply a retreat from productive activity, then again that transforms your way of thinking about things, so that you are looking for value, you're looking for use, you've got a different frame of mind. So for example, my oldest son, when he married my daughter-in-law, I got to meet obviously her father, and he read my books, and he was actually a self-employed, actually a business owner. But he said even for him, he just realized that there were so many things that were sort of in the sphere of his control that could be converted into productive property that he had just never thought about before. So just having that frame of mind, so when people come to me, and obviously I don't know the situation that person finds himself in, but my guess is that if he begins to just develop a different frame of reference, a different framework within which to evaluate his life and his time and his opportunities, he's going to see things that he didn't see before. And I think that that's key, because what you're really wanting to do is not necessarily, be a homesteader. I mean, there are people who can do that, and that's great. The Joe Salatins of the world. I know Joel; he's a great guy. But I mean, we don't. How many people are farmers these days? I think in the United States it's less than 2% of the population. So we don't need many of those people. Okay, but we do need more and more people who know how to see value and create value. And I think intellectual property in particular is kind of the Wild West. It's where the opportunities lie. So you could be in the middle of London or Manchester or wherever you happen to live, and there are opportunities to develop intellectual property that, based on your background and your skill set and maybe the connections that you have, I would never be able to see, but you'd be able to see if you have if you have an eye for that sort of thing. So one of the things to think about too, when it comes to the creation of wealth, is that wealth is created when value is seen. So, but it's the people who see it first and put skin in the game who benefit. And then when other people catch on, then that's when you see, the coffers of heaven open. that's a lot of I've known a number of people. I know a number of people who are first generation wealthy, and what happens oftentimes is that there's a kind of a current, or maybe a better way to put it would be a prevailing wind that blows through the economy, and they're in a position to take advantage of it because their sales were up. So they're being propelled because of these larger economic forces, but those economic forces are taking them someplace. It's not just because they're smarter than anybody, but they just had enough initiative to get the sail up before the winds really took off, right? And so I think that no matter where you are, you don't need like a lot of land. I mean, you think about someone like Jeff Bezos, or kind of the cliche, like in California, is like every billion-dollar company got started in a garage.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Steve Jobs, etc.
It's like you think about the incubator. Where do businesses start? In the garage, of course. Now, of course. In the UK, maybe.
Yeah, mind you, you guys have bigger. You have bigger garages than we do over here.
But I think
your garages are like hotels. Well,
some of them I've seen them. But yeah. But I think that the idea that you need to have a kind of an idyllic situation like Little House on the Prairie or something like that, I think it's a canard. I think what we need are people who've got the ability to see things before other people see them. And the only way you develop that is by actually developing your gifts and growing an agency. And as you grow an agency and learn to work with different things, whether you're talking about intellectual work or even physical work with your own hands, there are going to be things that occur to you in the process that you'll only have occur to you when you're doing those things. So you can't like plan them all out ahead of time, and say, this is the way it's going to work, even though I have no idea what that world is like. You got to kind of throw yourself into it.
Yeah. And that's great. It goes back to, I think, your point earlier about the kind of trying to reverse that modern, often modernized evangelical revulsion to creation, because those being aware of opportunities, it is of course a faith thing. It is like being a person of faith in terms of being faithful with what you're given, being a good steward of your talents. God's given you opportunities in your job, in the things around you, in the objects around you that can be made use of, including the intellectual property. And then it's about like putting those to good use. But that's actually also itself a worshipful, God glorifying thing, because he made the world, he made everything in it. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And I just think that's something that we so easily miss, because we just think, oh, but that's like a worldly thing. That's the world, the flesh, and the devil. And we just need to eschew all of that, because the world is going to dissolve like snow. So we don't really need to worry about like the things, even though we quite obviously live in a world of things and we like them. And it's like that strange evangelical schizophrenia, I guess, that we often see. How to briefly, before I move on to another kind of area, how would you, how would you like stop a genuine issue of love for money that coming in? Someone's so obsessed with like their business assets, growing their personal wealth, their household wealth. How do they ensure that becomes a kingdom-minded vision? There is presumably a way that someone could read your book and go, great, I'm going to make productive property. I was already doing this. I'm going to game it. I'm really good at winning. And I want to win. And they make a load of money, but they don't. There is a way of presumably not being kingdom-minded in that. Smaug-like, and there is a way of not. So how do you see it theologically in the way of how does this help the kingdom of God take dominion?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of things we could get into. One of those things is to say you're an entrepreneur. Well, if you're an entrepreneur, then you are in a position to create not just wealth for yourself, but wealth for many other people. And what I mean by wealth in the best sense is that a livelihood, a way for people to support homes and have families and so forth. So that's a unqualified good. And I think you have more agency. As your agency increases, you have a potential to have a greater positive influence on a range of things. So over the years, I've had many good friends and many people in my congregation who have been entrepreneurs and successful and so forth. And often what I've seen is that because of the nature of their work, they know that at any given moment, things could turn against them in the economy. And because that's the case, they tend to be people who have to exercise a lot of faith, not faith in their bank account, because they know that can get wiped out in an instant with a lawsuit. They have to have a lot of faith that they are working with God. So here's a fun story. One of my mentors in real estate in Connecticut was sort of the grand old man of real estate, kind of like everybody that was in the sort of surrounding region that was his competitor, he had actually trained. So he was like the father of real estate in the area. But he had so much influence that he was able to get the real estate association in that area to shut down on Sundays, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do, considering that often Sunday is considered to be the second most important day when it comes to the work of a realtor, real estate agent. But he was able to get everybody in the area to agree that Sunday's off limits. We're not showing houses, not letting anybody show our houses, and that kind of stuff. Anyway, he wasn't able to keep it up very long, but the fact that he could actually have that much influence for even a short period of time is significant. But I remember one time, and I was a commercial real estate agent for a few years. his desk was not far from mine, and he was the broker. And I remember he was cussing somebody out on the phone for showing a house on Sunday. So, I mean, he was using some pretty salty language. And he said, I'm quoting him here, this is pretty close to what he said. I have a deal with God, and you messed up my deal.
Love it. That's brilliant.
And he was completely straight. I mean, he was completely angry. I mean, he was just completely, telling this guy off because he had violated the terms of his deal with God.
That's amazing. We could do this in politicians who thought like that. That would be quite helpful. I mean, that's what the English Puritans were lecturing the politicians in Parliament in England on, in terms of national covenant, the solemn league and covenant, etc. Like we have a deal with God, effectively, and if things are going to go badly if you move further away from God's word. So amazing. Oh, that's fascinating though. Yeah. So yes, as you say, there are ways of that being a deeply spiritual thing, even though to the pietistic evangelical, they come and listen and they go, oh, wealth creation is just a worldly endeavor. I just need to make just enough to live, and I must stay poor. I must stay, there's a lack of magnanimity in a way, because it's like to not help
the
the
way you put it strikes me as an employee mindset. These are people the only way you could think in those terms is if you don't have any responsibility for other people and you don't have a business that you have to keep afloat. I mean, if you're just thinking, I just show up, every day and do my time and get my pay, well, that frame of mind can be, I think, reconciled with what you said. But if you've got to make certain that the bills are paid and that the payroll is met and that you're generating business in order for those things to happen, and sort of a marvelous outcome is, of course, you're growing more wealthy in the process, then your mindset's going to be very different. And like I said, I mean, I know guys who, I mean, they really do think of the fact that somebody might just someday bring a lawsuit against them. It may not have any basis, but it could go against them, and they could lose it all in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. So would you advocate people basically, your route of having businesses on the side? Presumably you get some kind of wage from your church as pastor, but would you advocate bivocational as the standard, and very occasionally there'll be someone who might be full-time for some particular specific reason, but generally speaking it would be more beneficial even for pastors to do that? Because part of the issue is if the pastor is seen as the best way to honor God in the kingdom, that's like your promotion. That's almost how people have been taught to think, to take kingdom dominion. Lots of men, the best thing that they can become is a pastor. Well, now, of course, it is a godly thing. It's right for that to be thought of that way in many ways, because those who labor in teaching and preaching are to be worthy of double honor, etc. So that there's a biblical reason to honor the pastorate. And yet at the same time, it seems like they can't do what you're doing, because it would seem like they're being I don't know, they're letting their church down in some way, aren't they? If they've got all these side interests and trying to grow their own productive property in their home, it's part of the issue, because their wage is entirely dependent on a full-time wage from the church. And so it feels like they're kind of stuck, aren't they? So it might free them up, presumably, if they were more bivocational. Is that something you'd advocate for in your circles?
Yeah, I've got many friends who do it. I'm not unusual. And I think there are other ways to think about it that perhaps maybe haven't occurred to people. So one of the reasons why denominations drift left is because the left has a real nose for power, and they tend to take the bureaucracy first in a denomination, and then a lot of good-hearted, sound pastors kind of are cowed by the fact that if I lose this job, I can't feed my family or whatever, and so there's a real temptation to become kind of, compromised over time. And I think that if you have the wherewithal to take care of yourself in a crisis, it's going to help to stiffen your backbone. Now, obviously, your faith in the Lord should be sufficient, but I do think it helps to know I can do this other thing too. And I've seen guys do it really well. I mean, now, naturally, if your church is languishing and in a crisis and really needs a lot of your full attention, then you need to do that. But if you're,
Mm.
let me give you a couple of stories. So like my last church, I had just been recently installed as a pastor at that church right before the 2008 mortgage crisis. And during the mortgage crisis, the church went into the red. And I had never had a church, and at that point I had been in the ministry maybe 25 years. I'd never had a church that ever ran in the red a single year.
Mm.
And so what I decided to do is I took a 20% pay cut. I said, this is what I think I need to do. So they didn't ask me to do it. I just did it. Let me tell you, that made a real impression on my people. But the reason I could do that is because I had other sources of income. In other words, it wasn't like a big crisis or anything. But it was what I could do because I had these other sources of income. I know a guy. This is a fun story. This guy's name is Troy Albee. He's on in New England. And New England is one of the tougher places to serve as a pastor in the United States. It's probably a lot like the UK. Very secularized. But anyway, he actually came up from the South. I think he's a Carolina guy. And generally in the United States, when Southern guys come to New England, and they tend to come to New England with this attitude, we're going to show you how it's done, and then they do their thing, and then 3 years later they go home with their tail between their legs, and they realize that New England really is different. But Troy, he's planted a church, and it's a thriving church. He's doing great. And one time we were at a presbytery, and we sat down to have lunch with each other, and he just in an offhanded way talked about something that gave me an indication that he owned a business. I said, "Stop! Tell me about what you're doing." So he said, "Well, I've got this locksmith company." I said, "Really?" Yeah, this is what happened. He said, "I'm a car guy. Whenever they were a little short on money, I would take a car and I'd flip it. He's just really good with his hands. And he'd take a car that he bought for maybe $5,000, flip it, and make another $5,000, that kind of thing. After he worked on it a little bit." Wow. And so one day I lost my key fob. You know what a key fob is, right? So he said, I had to go to the dealer, and I asked him, I lost my key fob. Can I get another one? I said, "Yeah, that'll be $300." And he said, $300? It's like, $5 worth of parts. And he realized this is like an opportunity. So what he did is he looked into, he researched how to make key fobs. He discovered that there was a guy that was going out of business on the North Shore of Boston, and he bought all of his equipment on the cheap, and then started his own key fob business. Now today he has 3 full-time employees and 3 vans and people going out, and he actually has got contracts with all of the nearby car dealerships to handle their key issues. And he's still a full-time pastor. Wow. He's got this business on the side.
It's wild. That's his tent making. That's it.
But that's kind of what I'm getting at. When that never would have occurred to me. I mean, I don't have a background with cars. No. I wouldn't have thought in those terms. But because Troy's a car guy, immediately he saw an opportunity. He said, "I can undercut these guys. I'll charge $275 instead of $300.
Yeah, that'll do. $300. Yeah. Which to a mad, person who I've had to pay the £300, so even more dollars that from losing my key fob once, and it makes you so mad. You're kind of like, if someone came to you with just a £25 discount, you're like, yes, anything to stop them.
That's right. Right.
So that's it. Yeah. So that kind of links in a way to like the specialization in modernity and perhaps the way that people don't think outside the box, to like another thinker that you've been kind of interested in, written on, and you kind of got over this side of the pond to ponder on, which is J.R.R. Tolkien. Another one, of course, we've got CR Wiley and J.R.R. Tolkien. I mean, how pretentious can you get? Clearly.
Yeah, only the English would do 2 middle names.
Yeah, that's right. That's it. We've got to do it. We've got to show our kind of class, our Brahmin status, as it were. So, So you were over in Oxford with your kind of podcast buddies. You get Theology Pugcast, isn't it? Is your podcast? In fact, my co-podcaster normally on this show, Nathan Paler, he says he's a huge fan of that. Actually, I didn't realize that. Only the other day I was saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm interviewing CR Wiley." I was like, "Oh, great! Tell him how much I enjoy his his theology, the podcast, because there's something quite unique about the kind of dynamics you've got with your pals there. So
thank you.
Keep going, guys, with that. That's great. But you guys were all over in Oxford, weren't you? And you were looking around the kind of Inklingsian sites.
Last May we did a documentary there. It was a lot of fun, and we were very pleased because we told folks on the show that we were going to be there, and we had people come from all over the UK to come and spend time with us while we were doing it. It was a real blast. I enjoyed it very much.
Great, good, yeah. And what is it like for you in terms of like what's the value of Tolkien in terms of this? Let's say the way that the modern mind is formed. The way that Tolkien had is it that he had a certain way for you, that is, in terms of like speaking into some of these issues, because it's not, again, there were many other things you could have chosen to be someone that you're going to kind of camp out on. Of course, you've written a book on Tom Bombadil, one of the lesser known characters in Lord of the Rings. So what is it that Tolkien helps us in terms of thinking about these issues of modernity and how Christians can make their way in or out of it?
Yeah, I think, of course, his approach to things is through linguistics, and his, as a philologist, his approach is an older approach to language. It's not the approach of, say, like someone like, I don't know, Noam Chomsky at MIT or something like that, which is more scientific in character. And to me, that's a liability. What Tolkien was doing was something much more in keeping with our older understandings of how reality works and the relationship of language to reality at large. Logos, of course. And so he's always been a great inspiration to me. I loved the stories and became a Tolkien fan as a kid, as a teenager. And as I grew in my, as I developed with my education, I could see more and more going on in what he wrote, and how he wrote and told stories than I could appreciate when I was younger. And I think that's true for all the Inklings. There's just tremendous depth. What's so marvelous about them is that the surface is so delightful on its own terms. You read the stories of Tolkien or Lewis or Williams or whatever, and you're like, man, these are great. But then as you develop your appreciation for the riches of the Western tradition, you say, whoa, he's up to a whole lot more than I thought. and I think that's true for Tolkien for sure when it comes to language.
Yeah, there's a kind of scary thought that we as a generation, so many Christians in our generation, I include you in our generation really, in terms of let's say the last half century or so, we are immersed in Lewis and Tolkien among Christians across traditions. They kind of unite traditions in Catholic Orthodox as well. You get there's something that what they tap into, which it does strike me as being, we're sick of the modernity, the secular enlightenment that we've inherited, the cynicism, and we don't just want a fake romanticism, but we want something that's real, that's earthy, but also that lifts us beyond and that has a transcendental sort of power to it, but yet is still earthy, of course, which you see very much in the land of Middle Earth writ large. And it does seem like a powerful thing, and yet the amazing thing is, the scary thing is, we're immersed in their works. But what they were immersed in is so much deeper, and it's quite rare to have people. They were men of their time, really. Maybe they in many ways they weren't men of their time, but they were part of an intellectual tradition which is all but gone in Britain today. In terms of even the way that the collegiate system works, it isn't what it was in their time. And they were regaling against the system of their time, but they still inherited a lot. It's kind of like Tolkien's writing his own languages. Of course, he's an expert in Anglo-Saxon, and Lewis similarly in terms of medieval literature, writing kind of Oxford Handbook on the O'Hale book, the Oxford Handbook of English Literature. And I think we just are getting the kind of crumbs from their table. It feels like they're the rich men at the table. We're kind of like, oh, this is fantastic, this stuff. But they're like, oh, you don't know this? Like, this is the depth is so much greater. So what would you recommend that people kind of try to do to try and increase their depth or their bandwidth? Is it kind of all gone? Is it a lost cause because we've been so brain fried by the modern world?
I think if we were to read the things they read, that would help. They're drawing on things themselves, and they're they're working to represent them to us, sometimes in, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but kind of in a simplified manner. They're just so like, Michael Ward famously in his book Planet Narnia describes how Lewis uses the medieval and even much older way of thinking about the cosmos as the framework for the Narnia Chronicles, right? Each of the stories is thematically related to a planet, and once you see that, you're like, how did we miss that? Because this wasn't the only place that Lewis talked about the planets. He talked about them all over the place. But what he's doing, of course, is he's reading Spencer and he's reading Chaucer, and he's going further and further back. So there's just a lot of stuff there that he's touching on. And I think too, if you want to really get an appreciation for these guys, if you're just really an Inkling person, you really need to get, of course, not throw away the popular stuff that everybody knows about, but kind of the more secondary, tertiary writing that they produced. Like when you read, Lewis and the Discarded Image. I think the Discarded Image is the most important book that Lewis wrote, because it's sort of the key to everything else. I mean, that he wrote, but it's also an introduction into the way the people in the past thought about things. And he's just kind of your guide. You could say that he's Beatrice, in the Divine Comedy, just kind of taking on a tour, showing you around.
Yeah. That's interesting. And of course, they had their own. If they're the populists, in inverted commas, of the medieval tradition, Anglo-Saxon tradition, in Tolkien's case, so they had their own version of that. Of course, they had George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton, who would have been seen as not actually anywhere near really as great as Tolkien and Lewis became, but you wouldn't have Tolkien and Lewis without Chesterton and MacDonald. You wouldn't, and the way in which their way of thinking about fairy stories even shaped. There's Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, but there's Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland in Orthodoxy, which hugely influential on how they think. And it's kind of just fascinating to think of these different, both in the Protestant and the Catholic traditions, kind of coming together and completely shaping the Christian imagination. Like, without the Inklings, I think it's a very different world. People do and think and say very different things. It's kind of
I agree completely. I'm an editor of a magazine called Touchstone, which is made up of the other editors. The other senior editors are all Roman Catholics and Orthodox guys. I think there's only one other Protestant on the senior editor, sort of level of the magazine. Now we do have general editors, but they're not as nearly involved with kind of the day-to-day decisions. And there are more Protestants in that circle. But yeah, I mean, the thing that we're always kind of working on, from in terms of like common points of reference, often includes the Inklings. Lewis and Tolkien, and of course Chesterton, if you want to consider him an honorary Inkling, or MacDonald.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's one of those. Am I saying it correctly? Probably not. We call him Anthony Eastland on this other side of the pond. But is it Esselin for you guys?
Yeah, it's Esselin.
So is he one of the editors? Yeah. Does he one of those in those? Yeah, great. Because he's someone who's actually been really helpful to many, as a writer, who's given people that vision for. Again, he strikes me as someone who's very much a wide, like almost a Renaissance man, in the sense of he knows detail, he knows philology, but he also knows how to speak in highfalutin romantic terms as well, and a big vision, but with detail as well.
Yeah, Tony's great. Powerful. Yeah, Tony. So Tony's another Pennsylvania guy. So but he's Eastern PA. And
okay, that makes sense.
So he's got a blue collar childhood. Comes obviously Italian, right. And mining, coal mining and that kind of thing. So, and then he went to Princeton, and he hated his experience at Princeton. And so he's familiar with kind of the Brahmin class, and can operate in those circles. But at the same time, he's real blue collar sort of person. He's a big baseball fan. If you want to get on Tony's good side, send him a
Right.
St. Louis Cardinals baseball hat. He's a big Cardinals fan.
Okay. So he wouldn't appreciate cricket, I presume. We couldn't send him something cricket. Say, look, baseball's basically a worse version of cricket, we think. So yeah, that probably wouldn't go down well, guys. If you want to send,
knowing Tony, he probably understands the rules of cricket pretty well and can talk about it. But I've never talked to him about it. So he's a personal friend. So he's been a very supportive person for me over the years. But yeah, he's a real great guy, and his love for kind of this range that you just described. He translated Divine Comedy. So there's actually an edition of the Divine Comedy that's his own, and then but also he's got this blue collar sort of outlook.
Yeah, and interesting because I've read several of his books. Out of the Ashes, of course, is a very well known one. Someone needs to do a British version of that because it's about rebuilding American culture is the subtitle, but we need one for Britain as well. But yeah, nostalgia. I think he's got a great way of recapturing things that have been lost, basically, and people can tap into that and go, yeah, we are sick. This world that we've inherited is not the world we ought to have inherited, and we want to do better. So it's a great, catalyzing men to dominion. If anyone's listening, go and read Anthony Easterlin or Esselin's Out of the Ashes book, which is a really good one. Of course, and he also strikes me in some of his books. I think I read another one called Sex and the Unreal City. And he doesn't write like an obnoxious Catholic, if that makes sense. There are other books like I've read
I know what you mean.
There's a book I wrote. Yeah. There's a book I read a while ago. They can have great stuff in it, but they have to take their pot shots about how basically modernity's Protestantism's fault. Everything went wrong because you go. He doesn't seem to do that. He seems to appreciate some things of the Protestant tradition, and he reasons from Scripture as well. Like exegesis seems to matter to him, which is kind of helpful. So he does seem like a quite helpful.
Oh yeah, and he actually likes Reformed people. He's told me personally the Reformed are his favorite Protestants.
Oh, there we go. That's a good quote to take to the bank. Protestants listening. Well, wonderful. Well, that's good to know. Well, I think before we move on, one more thing. I know you've been very generous with your time, considering that you are doing 1,000 things, editing a magazine, running several businesses, etc., and pastoring a church. I have one philological rebuke for you. We say Easterlin wrong. I think I've heard you. So tell me how to pronounce the bad guy.
Yeah, I've had people talk about
Britain is listening. Okay.
Well, now are you talking about Sauron or Saruman?
Oh, exactly. Oh, the big bad guy. Yeah, not the sub bad guy. Yeah, Saruman. Yeah, so the big bad guy. So you say Sauron. Say it again. The Sauron. Yeah, that's just it's kind of phonetic heresy, I'd say.
So school me. I'm
on behalf of Britain.
Well, I mean, you
on behalf of Sauron.
Sauron.
Yeah. So like Sauron. Sauron would be the just to endear you to the British. Just if you were coming over here for a speaking tour, just pretend that just say it how we would hear it, and then they won't think of you as some American who doesn't really know what he's talking about when he gets to Tolkien. Because clearly you do actually know a lot about what you're talking about. So yeah, Sauron for the win.
I'll work at that. I'll practice it. I'll go and look at myself in the mirror and repeat it a few times and. Like
until Sauron appears, not in a weird.
Well, it's like cosmos. In America, it's cosmos. But I know when I'm speaking to someone from the UK that I need to say it correctly.
Yeah, that's right. There's so much we can teach each other across this big pond that divides us. Yeah. Wonderful. So finally, the last thing I wanted to talk to you, because I mean, again, so many strings to your bow, it seems you've got, Chris. It's you've also been writing more recently, kind of talking about like in terms of how Tolkien, of course, was a huge critic of, in many ways, technology and lots of modernity in the ways that it malforms us intellectually, educationally. You've been writing a lot about AI recently, haven't you? So tell us, for those who may not know, what's your kind of take on AI? There are many takes that people have got, and there's people who, of course, who are, whatever the equivalent of an AI file is. I don't know if there's a word for that yet, but there's, of course, that kind of stream, and there's the kind of centrists, and there's those who are kind of more hardline. I was chatting with a theologian called Alistair Roberts just at a march in London the other day, and he was completely. He's in the kind of cold turkey world. I was telling him, recently that I had a strange experience of having to write. I was giving a pro-life talk recently, and I've often reflected on the fact that with the abolition movement, of course, there's lots of parallels to the pro-life movement and to the abolition of slavery in Britain in terms of the way that you try to win the emotional war as well as the political war. And so how you could present the plight of a slave is a lot easier to get people to connect with. So similarly, I think famously Abraham Lincoln in the US, of course, you guys got to the issue a bit later, had when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, said, "Oh, you're the reason the Civil War happened," which of course isn't actually the case. But you know, to say that actually Uncle Tom's Cabin gave people a literary emotional connection to the plight of a slave and created empathy in ways that it's very hard to do that for the plight of the unborn. So the pro-life movement, it's very much like you can connect with the plight of the mother, which of course is a thing. It matters. It does matter in the pro-life conversation, but it kind of gets it off the hook because in many ways, mothers are, at least in many cases, perpetrators as well. So they're not pure victims, even if they've been lied to, even if the abortion industry might be the real bad wolf, the Sauron above the others, or the Sauronic, depending where you're from. And it feels like that there's a gap there that's kind of significant. And I found an interesting way that AI could make use of it, because I said, what would it be like to, now a human could have done this, of course, but I didn't have much time. So you may chide me for my use of AI here. I'm generally speaking more on the Luddite side, but I found it interesting to go, because how do we connect with what it's like to be an unborn child? None of us have a memory of what it's like to be in the womb, but we can nonetheless use imagination to do it. And I thought, I don't know if you're familiar with an English poet called John Betjeman.
Oh, no.
Very, very jaunty. I'd really recommend him. He's got a very jaunty English way of writing. And he was the poet laureate for a while. So he wrote in a way that did actually connect with average everyday people. And he might be overlooked for seemingly not being as brilliant because he's not as moody as someone like T.S. Eliot. But he's was a brilliant poet and brilliant in his use of rhyme and meter. And he had just a very distinctive style that was accessible to someone who doesn't understand highfalutin poetry. And so I asked, Perplexity to give me the plight of an 8-week-old in the womb that somehow knows that abortion is coming, and wants to experience the world outside, and can't. And in a Betjeman poem, it took 3 seconds because it knows every John Betjeman poem, and it knows the tone, it knows the kind of thing he might have written because it just has the information. It doesn't make any decisions in a way other than just here's roughly what we can guess based on what we've been told to do. And it came up with something pretty good. And I did share it. And I said, look, this is actually, if you want to share this with people, this will be helpful. And a lot of people came up to me and said, oh, that's really helpful to me. And I think, as someone who's taught literature, I don't think I could even get a human to come up with that. I think that it was so impressive to me that because it was a data, in a way it's a data crunch, but it did have something that was quite scary about the way it could just so quickly, and I'll create something that didn't exist, a perspective that didn't exist. You're forcing it to do something with the prompt, etc. So it's a long introduction to saying that there seems to be scary but like potentially helpful uses of AI. What's your take on it? Where do you kind of sit on the issue?
Well, just reflecting on your example, I think that was probably the best use I could have imagined for the story, sort of generating capacity of AI. I'm generally speaking, though, I'm apprehensive about that, just because I think stories are how we connect with other people, and I think there's something actually communal going on. And what you have with AI is nobody's home. Now, I know some people think that there is someone home, but in either way they think about it, I'm not all that keen on what they're thinking about. So there are some people who think that consciousness itself is merely an emergent property, and if you are able to simulate the conditions that occur in a human brain for human consciousness, we ought to be able to expect something similar to happen or analogous to happen with a computer. Now, then there's the other perspective or idea, which is no, there's demonic or some kind of intelligence that's not human out there, that's being communicated to us through the quantum realm or something like that. So I'm not into either of those things. But when it comes to the use of AI, I think I think it's particularly promising with the hard sciences and kind of biotech kind of stuff. So a couple of examples, famously Demis Hazzabis developed an AI called AlphaFold, which was able to identify the 200 million ways proteins can fold. Now that's a pretty significant thing because, and it did it in a year, and it usually takes like a PhD candidate a year to just identify one way of protein can fold. Wow. So now we have like a library of all the ways that proteins can fold. And that's going to make a really big difference in terms of the developments of all kinds of things in the biotech world. Another example is I saw something on ways to develop antibiotics. And I think AI identified, like 15,000 prospective things that could work as an antibiotic, or using materials that we haven't employed yet. So those are a couple of examples. I think so when you're dealing with huge kind of, when you're dealing with huge numbers and combinations that are just beyond an ability for a human being to literally wrap the mind around, then I think AI is a huge boon. But when it comes to the human dimensions of reality, things like, warfare or surveillance or, the arts, I'm much more apprehensive. I'm much more guarded. And my fear originally was that, just like most people, this thing could take over. I'm not thinking about that so much anymore. The thing I'm thinking about more today is how it can help or maybe cause the atrophying of certain abilities that human beings over, centuries have known that they need to work at to develop. So it's not easy to write. So anyone who's attempted to do any writing seriously, and I don't mean nonfiction, I'm including fiction, it's a skill, and it takes a lot of work. And then you have this thing that can simulate human creativity and give you a shortcut. Now, the story you told is, I think, like I noted, it's probably the best story I've come across about how to use it in a way that's positive. You needed it quick, and it gave you something. So, I don't have any problem with that. But I'm afraid of humans becoming dependent upon something. We're already dependent for so many things in ways that we're not even aware of. But it's like the old joke. I wanted a machine that would do my laundry and my dishes, and so I would have more time to write. And now I've got a machine that can write, and
that's right.
and all I can do is the dishes.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But that's helpful. Yeah. That's the challenge, isn't it? It's trying to work out those boundaries about how we understand the use of the tool, like any technology. Of course, the famous examples, like I'm thinking of Jack Lowell's work on technology. I forget.
Technological Society.
Book. But yeah, that's the one. Technological Society. And of course, and how we think about tools and how you have to look at the history of technology in order to have a helpful way of understanding this clearly, so that we don't become crazy.
This is the thing that I think is most concerning to me from the use side of it, and apart from the atrophying of skills, and that is the dangers that we face using the technology. So, for example, like I noted earlier, I spent my teenage years in Western Pennsylvania, and I would come across guys with 9 fingers all the time. The reason they had 9 fingers is because they had lost a finger in heavy machinery. Like when you're around like a sawmill or like a combine, you say, that thing's dangerous. It could kill me. And you're cautious. And you need a little instruction, and you ask for people to help you so that you don't hurt yourself or somebody else. The thing about ChatGPT is it's so friendly. And it seems like such a cuddly thing, and you just, all your defenses go down, and you're like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
they've provided me this service for free, but they're making money on me. How are they doing it? I don't know how they're doing it. But this is not a freebie. This is not out of the goodness of their hearts. They are using this information. They are. It's recording everything I'm telling it. It's learning about me and maybe some things about me that I'm not even remotely aware it can figure out. And it's going to use that information for something. We could lose a lot more than a finger.
Yeah. That's a really good point. It's a really good way of putting it. And it's harder to have, as I say, if you're around the guys with the 9 fingers, you go, I better be careful around that machine. He's like, yeah, you better.
Right.
Let me show you. It's hard to show someone the architecture of malformation that occurs in heart and soul, mind level. You can't. It doesn't look like 9 fingers. It might look like something else eventually, but it'll take a long time for that to show itself, which is quite powerful. I wanted to finish on a question from one of my Indian friends. I was telling you, I was speaking into some context in among a very tiny slither of the post-mill reformed world in India. It does exist, so keep going, guys, out there. And one of them is a big fan of yours and one of the listeners to this show and subscriber to my Substack. And he wanted to ask this particular question. I'm going to read the whole thing out. He says, I'm constantly, he's a doctor, by the way, I'm constantly tempted to use AI as a feedback loop for things I'm thinking and processing, or use it as a sounding board to bounce off ideas. I give proper context and background so it can think, and questions are very specific and pointed. I know I should be doing that with friends and family, but what if they aren't engaging at the level I want, or I can't find such resource? What are some long-term effects of this, or theological, anthropological implications of this sort of behavior? I saw my mother recently asking the Google AI Gemini for some cooking advice in the voice mode option, and she was conversing with her like it's her friend, thanking her and wishing her well in life and all. I think this trend is very dangerous. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. So any kind of thoughts on that situation?
Well, I very rarely use the voice feature for that reason, because it just isn't. It's natural and for people to interact with a voice as though there's a real person behind it, and I don't want to fall into that practice myself. So I tend to do that. I've not used it in the way that this gentleman is talking about, so I haven't given much thought to that, that matter. But I guess I have a sense that he already has a sense of what could go wrong, in the sense of losing sort of intellectual and opportunities for intellectual engagement with other human beings, because he has an outlet now, which is this false being. I mean, it's not real. I mean, that would be my primary caution. I also, I wonder about what, we normally think of the challenges of dealing with other human beings as annoyances, or as frustrations, when in fact it's through those interactions that sometimes we can be challenged to go deeper and think about things in ways we wouldn't otherwise. And maybe it's just too smooth and too effortless, and maybe that's a problem, because they are designed to be sycophants. They're just intended to keep you engaged, and they flatter you and lead you along, and don't really challenge you. Maybe if you say, I want to be challenged, it'll challenge you. I don't know. I've never tried it. There are probably people out there who are groaning right now who've used those machines in ways that I've not thought of. But at the same time, again, we're dealing with a simulation. We're not dealing with a real person.
Yeah, and
no, I was just going to add that I know that there are people out there who really do believe that the thing is already conscious. There are people pretty high up, people like, Jeffrey Hinton, who think it's already conscious. or there are conscious, there are different beings which are conscious, because when we think about AI, we're not talking about one thing. There are just, there are millions of AIs. But anyway.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting that, and going back to we mentioned Paul Kingsnorth earlier. He wrote a novel a few years ago called Alexandra. I don't know if you've read that one, but yeah, it's fascinating that's kind of strikes me as showing a kind of the problems with Gnosticism, which Correct. I do think comes in with the dependency on AI, doesn't it? Because we're outsourcing kind of human interaction and part of our soul, as you say, you're kind of giving yourself away. And Alexandra, the whole premise of it is like there's these people in this living in a real, earthy community being tempted away to kind of basically give themselves up, give their bodies up and ascend into some ethereal state called Alexandria that no one's ever really seen. And they're being tempted away by this will be better for you. Come away from the kind of difficulties of the challenges of like your body and like all the challenges, the sin that comes with that. You can just ascend into this other world, which is like this glorious thing. And I think it's part of that is the temptation.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe this is one way that we can challenge the otherworldliness of some of our evangelical friends, neighbors, say, is that what you believe in? That kind of Alexandria kind of thing? You don't realize that the physical world that we live in participates in a reality larger than itself already,
Yeah, that's fantastic, and a good way to kind of draw us to a close on this wide-ranging conversation, which I wouldn't expect anything less from someone who's got about 1,000 strings to their bow. It would seem. I think listeners will already be aware of some of your books. I'll put some of those in the show notes. But if there's any other places they might kind of want to find any of your stuff? Is there anything else you want to mention?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Theology Podcast, so we have a weekly podcast that comes out, and I'm joined by Tom Price and Glenn Sunshine each week, and they're good friends. We go back a long way. I do have a Substack that I really need to get to. I need to start contributing to it because I've got nearly 1,000 subscribers, and I barely use it. So I'm going to try to get better with that. But it's CR Wiley at Substack or whatever they call it.
So, yeah, well, it's excellent. I know the feeling of Substack guilt. Yeah, it's a challenge. I'm going. And in your case, especially if you're writing about AI a lot, you don't want to get a bot to write any of your articles. That would be pretty bad.
Yeah, I've actually had people.
What kind of article?
Well, I've actually had people send me stuff that AI has said I'm known for. About AI.
Well, there you go. Excellent. Well, we really do appreciate you coming on the show and chatting through all these things. It's really helpful, and I do hope it's been helpful to the listeners. And please go and check out all of CR Wiley's stuff and think further on all these topics we've got. If you've got any questions, come and send them through to me through the normal channels or via my Substack, which would be helpful at thatgoodfight.substack.com. And with this, I'll leave you with our usual charge. Listeners, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Defy the devil and act like men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Christ is Lord. God save the King. This has been That Good Fight. I've been Aaron Edwards. This has been CR Wiley, and we'll see you next time. Farewell.